You think it's desire, but it's not. It's your soul trying to warn you that it has lost itself. Carl Jung said that modern man does not suffer from a lack of pleasure, but from an excess of distraction. You're not addicted to bodies, you're addicted to not feeling. And that's why the more pleasure you seek, the more emptiness you feel. Spirituality doesn't call you to deny desire, but to see what lies behind it. Because the real addiction lies not in the touch, but in the escape. In the desperate attempt to avoid the pain that, ironically, is the only thing capable of healing you. What you call lust, Jung called mourning. I grieve for the part of your soul that you abandoned while trying to be strong. But what if desire wasn't the enemy? What if it was the map? What if what you try to erase every night is precisely the path back to yourself? There's something almost poetic and at the same time tragic in the way human beings try to fill the void they feel with increasingly intense stimuli. It's as if the body screams for pleasure while the soul only whispers for meaning. Carl Jung said that spirituality begins precisely when anesthesia stops working, when pleasure is no longer enough, and the individual finds themselves for the first time facing their own shadow. Modernity has sold the idea that everything that hurts should be healed quickly, preferably with a touch, a screen, or a dose of dopamine. But nobody told you that this hole isn't physical, it's psychic. It's the echo of disconnection from the self, the silent distancing from inner presence. People chase after new bodies, new objects, new plans, believing that the next something will solve the emptiness of the present. And what happens? They feel even emptier, because what's missing isn't stimulation, it's meaning. Modern man calls this boredom, but it's soul hunger. He confuses pleasure with relief and believes he's alive when he's merely avoiding dying inside. Spirituality teaches that this impulse to seek, this unbridled desire, is actually the soul trying to make itself heard. When Jung speaks of individuation, he doesn't speak of perfection, but of reconnection. It means looking into the inner abyss and realizing that what you call lack might be the self's call asking to be remembered. That's why, even after intense nights, intense people and strong sensations, comes that silent pause, a kind of silence between breaths, where the heart seems to ask, "Is that all?" This question isn't a punishment, it's an invitation. A reminder that the shadow doesn't want to destroy you, it only wants to be heard. And it's at this point that pleasure begins to reveal itself like a mirror. What you pursue outside is what you've lost inside. The curious thing is that when a person decides to stop running away, something extraordinary happens. The emptiness begins to transform into fertile ground. The same space where despair once resided now becomes a field for awareness, creativity, and presence. But for this to happen, courage is needed, the courage to remain, to resist the temptation to fill each silence with noise, each pause with distraction. If emptiness is the symptom, presence is the antidote. And it is at this moment, when the soul tires of running, that integration begins to whisper. Pleasure ceases to be an escape and becomes a bridge. And whoever listens to this call, sooner or later, discovers that desire was never the enemy. It was merely the way the unconscious found to call the individual back home. But most still flee from this call, and that is where the soul's flight is born. The human soul has a silent talent for escaping itself. And the most curious thing is that it always finds plausible excuses: too much work, tiredness, distractions, just 5 more minutes on the phone. Carl Jung said that modern man has lost contact with the sacred precisely because he fears his own reflection. When silence arrives, he doesn't hear the call of spirituality, he hears the echo of his own shadow, and he runs. This invisible race is the mark of disconnection. The body lives in the present, but the soul inhabits an unresolved past. And in this subtle escape, pleasure becomes anesthesia. The world becomes a huge analgesic disguised as routine. People pride themselves on not stopping for a second, without realizing that constant movement is just a sophisticated way of not feeling. It's the fear of facing the inner void, the same void that, ironically, calls for presence. It's like someone trying to put out a fire with gasoline. The more one chases after stimuli, the further one becomes from oneself. Jung saw this behavior as a collective symptom of modernity. The soul wants to find itself, but the ego wants to distract itself. That's why, instead of praying, many open TikTok. Instead of meditating, they watch meditation videos. And instead of living, they record what seems like life. Spirituality is not a distant refuge. It's the art of being fully present in what one feels, even if it hurts. When the soul flees, the body pays the price. Insomnia, anxiety, subtle addictions. All of these are physical manifestations of a psychic disconnection. The cure is not in fleeing faster, but in stopping. Stopping is not giving up. It's the first act of courage. And this simple, almost banal act is the beginning of integration. It's when man begins to remember that it's not his desire nor his haste, it's the space between them. But stopping is frightening. When the noise ceases, the soul speaks, and what it says is sometimes not beautiful. It's an inventory of everything that has been repressed: fear, lack, pride, pain. Jung called this the encounter with the shadow, the moment when the unconscious demands to be looked at. And here lies the paradox. Fleeing seems easier, but it requires more energy. Flight exhausts, silence recharges. That's why, when the individual surrenders to presence, they discover that what they feared most was, in fact, what they most needed to find. Flight, then, no longer makes sense. The soul tires of running and begins to remember that the way back is not on the roads of the world, but within its own heart. And it is in this reunion that the shadow begins to manifest, no longer as an enemy, but as a guide. Because the next step of the journey is inevitable, the shadow comes into action. The shadow doesn't appear with a somber face or red eyes. It emerges disguised as desire, urgency, harmless pleasure. It's that impulse that makes someone open their phone at 2 a.m. saying, "Just a little more," while in reality trying to fill a loneliness they can't even name. Carl Jung said that the shadow is the sum of everything a person refuses to be, and therefore desire becomes the theater where the unconscious stages what the conscious mind has repressed. When an individual believes they are seeking pleasure, what they are really seeking is relief from the pain of being disconnected from themselves. Spirituality calls this the forgetting of the soul, when the body acts, but the spirit watches from a distance. And the curious thing is that the more someone tries to hide their shadow, the more it acts. It drives the car, answers messages, chooses partners, all with an almost invisible elegance, until pleasure transforms into punishment and what was relief becomes an abyss. The shadow in action is not a punishment, it's a misunderstood attempt at healing. It's the wounded part trying to love in the way it learned, through repetition. The man who seeks approval in different bodies isn't seeking sex, he's seeking a belated embrace from childhood. The woman who falls in love with someone who always rejects her isn't seeking pain. She's seeking recognition where she was once ignored. Jung understood this as the secret language of the unconscious. Each painful pattern is a letter addressed to consciousness, asking to be read. And while the ego tries to extinguish the fire with distractions, the shadow lights more matches. Addiction isn't the enemy, it's the messenger. Pornography, empty messages, almost intimate conversations, all are symptoms of a soul that has lost its presence and tries to find itself in reflections. The shadow doesn't want to destroy the individual, it wants to integrate them. But like a neglected child, it screams in the way it learned, by making noise. And it is at this point that spirituality and Jung meet. Both say, look, that's all. Don't fight, don't repress, don't run away. Look, because the act of looking transforms. When a person observes their own impulse without judgment, something begins to dissolve. The energy previously spent on guilt becomes awareness. The shadow ceases to be an enemy and becomes a master. And it is here that true healing begins. When the human being understands that light is not born by denying darkness, but by traversing it, desire then loses its poison and gains purpose. It becomes an invitation to introspection, a reminder that what we seek outside is always an echo of what we have forgotten inside. But for this looking to happen, courage is needed, and this courage is born from a question that disarms the ego and reveals what lies behind all escape. What is this desire trying to distract me from feeling? There's a question that, when asked honestly, disarms any mask the ego has built to protect itself. What is this desire trying to distract me from feeling? At first it seems simple, but in practice, it's like holding a mirror up to your own soul. Carl Jung said that people will do anything to avoid facing their own shadow, and it's true. The human mind is an architect of distractions. It creates justifications, habits, commitments, and even virtues to avoid feeling what hurts. Spirituality, however, is not about eliminating discomfort, but about understanding what it wants to reveal. When the individual dares to ask themselves this question, the race ceases. The desire that once dominated transforms into a code to be deciphered, and the answer almost always surprises. What they call pleasure is often an attempt to silence the pain of disconnection from the self. The ego hates this question because it breaks its spell of control. It thrives on distractions, and every quick pleasure is a way to ensure the soul remains asleep. Jung understood the ego as an efficient but blind administrator. It wants to maintain order, even if it costs the truth. Therefore, when consciousness awakens, the ego tries to sabotage the process. It's not the right time, you're tired, this is nonsense. It creates excuses to continue on autopilot because it fears the chaos that comes with self-knowledge. But this chaos is sacred. It is the chaos of birth, the same that precedes any transformation. Spirituality teaches us that asking is more important than answering. The act of questioning already opens cracks in the unconscious. It's like turning on a flashlight in a dark room. The fear doesn't disappear, but its form changes. And, little by little, desire ceases to be the enemy and becomes language. The power of this question lies in its simplicity. It restores our presence. When someone feels an impulse and, instead of acting, breathes and asks why, something realigns. It is at that moment that integration begins. Because the desire no longer needs to be followed. It begins to be understood. This is not repression, it is awareness. The soul doesn't want you to deny pleasure, it wants you to experience it lucidly. Jung called this transforming libidinal energy into creative energy. The same fire that destroys can warm, illuminate, create. When the individual learns to channel this fire, they discover that the impulse was not a prison, but a compass. The question opens the way to something greater. The rediscovery of one's own inner feminine, the anima, which has long tried to manifest itself through desire, but which can only be found when the ego finally falls silent. There is a type of longing that cannot be explained with words. It is the longing for oneself. Carl Jung said that within every man lives an invisible woman, the anima, the feminine principle of the soul, the guardian of sensitivity and intuition. She is the mirror where the unconscious recognizes itself. When a man disconnects from this inner presence, He begins to seek it outside, projecting it onto faces, bodies, and stories that seem different, but are always the same plot. The unconscious attempt to rediscover the lost part of himself. That is why certain looks disarm him, certain perfumes hypnotize him, certain voices make him forget where he is. It is not passion, it is projection. The desire for that woman is, in fact, the desire for his own soul, for the tenderness he lost along the way while trying to be too strong. And until he realizes this, he will continue to confuse fire with love and intensity with connection. The anima is the bridge between the unconscious and the self, but to cross it, vulnerability is necessary, something the ego deeply fears. Modern culture has taught man to repress the inner feminine, to distrust emotion, to hide tears, to transform all sensitivity into shame. The result is a fragmented being, rational, productive, but empty. Spirituality invites us to take the opposite path, to return to the soul, not to appearances. This begins simply, listening to one's own feelings without trying to fix them, observing the body without rushing responses, silencing the mind without fear of what it may reveal. Jung saw in this reconciliation the true act of courage, allowing oneself to feel again, because feeling is the verb of the soul. The man who returns to feeling regains access to intuition, to compassion, to presence. And when this happens, desire ceases to be a cry and becomes a whisper. Pleasure ceases to be urgency and becomes reverence. But the reunion with the anima is not an event, it's a process, a kind of silent initiation. At first, everything seems confusing. He feels like crying for no reason, perceives beauty in simple things, begins to prefer silence to external voices. This is not weakness, it's integration. The anima is speaking again, and when it speaks, the man changes his way of loving. He no longer desires to possess, he desires to understand. He no longer seeks to be admired, he seeks to be present. The woman ceases to be a mirror of neediness and becomes a reflection of consciousness. It's at this point that desire becomes sacred, the body becomes a temple, touch becomes prayer. And then he understands. It was never about her. It was always about the part of him that she represented. But the ego doesn't relinquish control easily. It fears the collapse that comes after this discovery, the collapse of the illusion that sustained this entire search. Every quest begins with a promise. The promise that upon achieving what one desires, peace will finally come. But the soul knows it's a lie. It watches silently as the ego builds temples of illusion upon sandy ground. Carl Jung said that the greatest danger is not error, but identification with what is not real. When desire is disconnected from love, it implodes upon itself. Pleasure becomes anesthesia, the body a prison. Man believes he is experiencing freedom, but he is merely repeating his own imprisonment. It is at this point that the collapse begins, the instant when pleasure no longer relieves, fantasy no longer excites, and the emptiness, previously contained, begins to overflow. Spirituality calls this moment the night of the soul, the portal where all that is false collapses and what is true finally breathes. The problem is that almost no one wants to see what they have built crumble, even if it was a gilded prison. Illusion is comfortable. It offers routine, control, predictability. And the ego feeds on that. It prefers to repeat known pain rather than open itself to the unknown of healing. Jung called this psychic possession, when a complex takes control and the individual begins to act against themselves. It's as if something inside them presses the self-destruction button in the name of a sensation that never arrives. The soul observes this theater with compassion because it knows that behind every mistake, there is a plea for love. The person thinks they are seeking pleasure, but what they are seeking is reunion. That's why, when desire is exhausted, what emerges is not the end, but the beginning. The collapse of illusion is not punishment, it is mercy. It is the soul saying, "You've played enough games with forgetting me." And in that instant, what previously seemed like loss is revealed as liberation. Pleasure dies, but the being is reborn. Only this rebirth hurts, and the ego confuses it with death. The curious thing is that when everything collapses, life finally becomes real. A person begins to feel what they always avoided: sadness, loneliness, regret, fear. But along with that comes something new: presence, that feeling of being for the first time, truly alive. It is in this space of ruin that the soul begins to rebuild, not from masks, but from essence. Spirituality teaches that only what is true survives the fire of consciousness. And Jung said the same. Integration is born from the friction between opposites. Desire doesn't need to be destroyed, only purified by the gaze. And when the gaze is sincere, the fire that once burned begins to illuminate. Man ceases to be a prisoner of illusion and becomes a student of his own shadow. But it is at this point, when everything seems lost, that the price of awakening arises, the death of sensitivity, the risk of hardening the heart so as not to feel so much. If you realize when it begins, it's not an event, it's a fading. One day, laughter no longer sounds so light. The music that once made you cry becomes mere background noise. The soul begins to get used to the silence, but not the sacred, the numb silence. Carl Jung said that when man loses contact with the self, he also loses the ability to feel the world. Spirituality calls this inner exile. It's the price of a life lived in flight. The individual becomes so disconnected from their own pain that inevitably they also disconnect from their joys. Pleasure becomes performance, love becomes distraction, and sensitivity, which was once an antenna to the invisible, is sacrificed in the name of emotional survival. And the most tragic thing is that this happens so gradually that man believes he is becoming stronger, when in reality he is only becoming more distant. The addiction to stimulation is the silent killer of this sensitivity. Easy touch, immediate pleasure, constant consumption, all of this trains the mind to seek intensity instead of depth. Jung saw in this search a clear symptom of disconnection. The soul, hungry for meaning, accepts crumbs of dopamine to avoid dying of boredom. Presence disappears, creativity dries up, and the soul, which once expressed itself in small epiphanies, now only speaks through exhaustion. It's at this point that spirituality ceases to be an option and becomes a necessity. It is no longer a matter of belief, but of psychic survival. Human beings need to feel again, not just anyway, but consciously. And this requires practice. It requires them to turn off the noise for a moment, breathe deeply, feel their body, and ask, "What in me is still alive?" This simple question is the first step in rescuing what has been put to sleep. But the return of sensitivity is not comfortable. It's almost like giving birth. Everything that was repressed resurfaces: fear, anger, shame, longing. The soul, upon awakening, demands space, and the frightened ego tries to negotiate. Better to keep sleeping. But it's no use anymore. Once consciousness awakens, there's no going back. Jung said that the individuation process is painful because it's real. It forces man to feel what he pretended didn't exist. Spirituality, then, invites the courage to remain, to traverse the discomfort without anesthesia. It is in this fire that integration happens. Pleasure, once an addiction, becomes a celebration again. Silence, once suffocation, becomes a refuge again. And when the heart finally feels again, something inside whispers, "You are still here." But the awakening of the soul brings a new challenge, deeper and more inevitable, the night of the soul, where the shadow ceases to be a symbol and becomes a living presence. There comes a point in the journey when silence doesn't console, it consumes. The soul, tired of being ignored, begins to scream in the subtext of life. Carl Jung called this psychic possession, when a complex takes control and the person ceases to act, becoming acted upon instead. It's the moment when they know what they're doing, but can't stop. Spirituality recognizes this point as the dark night of the soul, when everything false crumbles and the human being finds themselves stripped of certainties. It's the collapse of control, the collapse of the persona. The individual is no longer in command, the unconscious is. And yet there is something sacred in this, because it is in this abyss that the true self begins to be born. The ego weeps, but the soul flourishes. The person who once considered themselves master of their own destiny now realizes they were always just a guest, and the host is their own shadow. During this phase, everything that once brought pleasure loses its flavor. Touch no longer fulfills. Success no longer excites. Faith no longer comforts. The being feels strange in their own skin, as if they were a stranger within themselves. Jung described this as the encounter with the inner other, the repressed part of the psyche that finally demands attention. Psychic possession is painful because the ego tries to resist, and the more it fights, the deeper it sinks. The soul, on the other hand, does not want destruction, it wants surrender. You want the person to stop fighting against themselves. It is the moment when disconnection reaches its peak, and paradoxically, presence begins to be born. Spirituality teaches that the path is not to resist chaos, but to traverse it consciously. Chaos is the birth of the new being, and despair is merely the echo of the old saying goodbye. Everything that seems like ruin is actually reconstruction, and when the individual finally surrenders, something changes. The impulse loses control, the emptiness loses its power, and silence gains meaning. Man discovers that he was never his own enemy, only a hostage of his own unconscious. Jung said that the soul is not healed by force, but by acceptance, and it is at this moment, when resistance dissolves, that the fire of the shadow transforms into the light of presence. Spirituality calls this reconciliation, the return of the exile to his own temple. It is not the end of pain, it is the beginning of lucidity. Desire ceases to be a prison and becomes language. Fear ceases to be an obstacle and becomes a guide. Man realizes that the shadow did not possess him to destroy him, but to remind him of who he is. And now, on the threshold between destruction and rebirth, arises the most silent and transformative invitation of all, the call to return to presence. After the longest darkness comes the moment when the air changes, almost imperceptibly, but unmistakably. It is the return to presence. Carl Jung said that true awakening is not a sudden illumination, but a slow and patient remembering of oneself. The soul does not return with noise, it returns with breath, and suddenly something simple happens. The individual feels the body again. You feel the weight of your feet, the touch of the air, the movement of your chest when you inhale. Spirituality teaches that this is the sign of healing, when consciousness begins to inhabit the body again. Because the escape has always been outward, towards screens, towards others, towards excesses, but the way back is inward. It is the return to the psychic home, the reunion with the self. The soul, which once cried out for attention, now speaks in whispers, and each whisper is a reminder. You were never lost, only absent. At this point in the journey, desire changes its function. It ceases to be an escape mechanism and becomes a compass for reconnection. The impulse no longer needs to be repressed, it is observed. Pleasure is no longer the enemy, it is neutral energy that, guided by consciousness, transforms into creation. Jung called this sublimation. the process of converting the brute force of the shadow into creative power. Spirituality recognizes this as inner alchemy. The fire that once burned now illuminates, and this transformation begins in simplicity. Man learns to be present even in small things, drinking coffee, walking, listening attentively to someone. Each gesture becomes a prayer. Each pause, a temple. Presence is the antidote to disconnection. It is the invisible bridge between the human and the divine, between the ego and the self. And whoever crosses it discovers that life was not out of control, only out of focus. Presence doesn't promise the absence of pain, but the presence of meaning. And that's precisely what heals, because pain, when felt consciously, loses its power to destroy. It transforms into the language of the soul, into fuel for integration. Jung said that one does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious. That's it. Light is a consequence of the courage to look. When man accepts his shadow, the shadow transforms into soil. The self begins to flourish where there was once escape. Spirituality then ceases to be theory and becomes direct experience. The simple act of being here, whole, lucid, alive. The return to presence is not the end of the journey, it is the beginning of consciousness anew. But the soul, now awakened, already senses the next step, to transform this reunion into something permanent, integrating everything that was once separated. And that's where the final call arises, integration and the return to the self. Reaching this point is like waking from a lifelong dream. Carl Jung said that integration isn't about becoming perfect, it's about becoming whole. It's the moment when the human being, tired of being divided between light and shadow, begins to realize that both are part of the same sun. Spirituality calls this a return to the self, when consciousness begins to revolve around the center again, and no longer around wounds. Man stops searching outside for what already dwells within. The need to prove, conquer, or be seen loses strength because he understands that presence is value enough. The soul doesn't ask for applause, it asks for coherence. And when this coherence is born, something changes in the inner atmosphere. The body relaxes, the gaze softens, the heart becomes a dwelling place again. What was once struggle becomes rhythm. What was once pain becomes language. Integration is accepting the paradox, feeling pain, and yet being at peace. Jung said that the self is the point where all opposites meet and stop fighting. It is where man and shadow shake hands. Lust, once an escape, becomes compassion. Desire, once a symptom, transforms into creativity. Spirituality calls this transmutation, the fire that no longer consumes but illuminates. And the most beautiful thing is that nothing is lost in this process. No failure is discarded, no fall is wasted. Everything becomes material for the soul to build meaning. The man who once saw himself as a hostage to his own impulses now observes them with tenderness, as one who recognizes the effort of a part that only wanted love. Integration is not the end of the journey. It is the beginning of a new way of existing, more lucid, calmer, more alive. And the most curious thing is that nothing outside has changed. It was he who finally returned home. Ultimately, integration is an act of forgiveness. Not moral forgiveness, but existential forgiveness. The forgiveness of allowing oneself to be human, of looking in the mirror and, instead of demanding perfection, giving thanks for having survived one's own forgetfulness. Jung said that the self is the destiny that always called, even when the ego pretended to be deaf. Spirituality recognizes this moment as a return, the point at which man finally understands that he never needed to become enlightened, only to remember. Desire, addiction, shadow, disconnection, all were part of the same map. And now, with this map in hand, he no longer seeks exits, he seeks presence. He understands that pleasure, when conscious, is sacred, that silence, when embraced, is healing, and that love, when born from within, is whole. And so, with open eyes and a clean heart, the soul whispers, "Welcome back." Everything you were searching for outside was, all along, begging to be felt inside. Carl Jung said that the soul only falls silent when it is listened to, and perhaps that is what life is trying to teach you between the lines. Now you know that desire is not the villain, it's the messenger. He just wants to remind you of the forgotten part, the light that lay dormant under the weight of haste and pain. The question is, will you continue running away? Or will you have the courage to listen to what your soul has been whispering for so long? Stop getting distracted by the next body, the next stimulus, the next relief. Breathe. Stay. Look inward with the same intensity with which you have always searched outside. That's where the self awaits you, not to judge you, but to bring you back home. If any part of this video awakened you, confronted you, or healed you, then that's already a sign that something has begun to move within you. Don't let this movement die in silence. Write in the comments what touched your soul the most, because sometimes healing begins with the first word spoken aloud. And if you want to continue learning, diving in, and transforming along with me, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. Here, each video is a mirror, and every soul, when it looks deep enough, finds its way back.